Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're covering daggers, short swords, and scimitars. These are the weapons that are both light and finesse, meaning they attack with your dexterity, and you can use one of them in each hand, effectively doubling your damage output for a big chunk of the game. These weapons are part of some of the absolute highest damage setups available in Baldur's Gate 3 because you get two of them. So they're perfect for any character that wants to make a ton of attacks in a round, any character that has additional uses of their bonus action, or any character that simply just does a lot of damage per attack and thus wants to make more attacks. Since these weapons are part of such powerful setups, it's of course very important to know which of them are the best, so we're going to talk about which daggers, short swords, and scimitars your characters should be equipping. Just as with my previous weapon tier list for bows, and all of my item tier lists, which of course you should go check out if you haven't seen them, we will be rating these weapons based on their power level at the point in the game where you acquire them. In other words, how good are they relative to the equipment that you currently have? Should you pick them up and equip them, or can you safely ignore or sell this weapon? In S tier, I will be placing weapons that are best in slot for wide variety of builds that use this weapon type, or specific extremely powerful builds. In A tier, I will be placing weapons that make interesting alternatives to the S tier weapons. They might enable a unique strategy or be used for certain kinds of characters. In B tier, I will be placing weapons that have sort of off-meta uses. Either you use them for just a couple encounters in the game, or they can enable a slightly weird character, or specific unusual party comps may want B-tier weapons. In C-tier, weapons that have very narrow or marginal uses, they're maybe more used for themed builds than builds that are designed to be as optimized as possible, but are still weapons that are totally usable and have cool and interesting effects. And then in D-tier, weapons that you will rarely want to use because they are simply outclassed by the other options available. It's also worth noting for this weapon category that most characters that are using this kind of weapon want two of them, which means that we're going to be a little bit more generous in our tiering than we were for bows, because for bows, most parties that want a bow only want one bow, maybe two, whereas most parties that want daggers and short swords are going to want multiple of them so that their character can be dual wielding. Finally, before I begin, I want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to John Walker for the $20 donation, Katrina Ryan for the $25, and Michael Baya, Azalea, Stephen Stezo Thorne, and Demir Kupich for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support, and it really does mean a lot. Alright, let's talk daggers. I'm going to start by talking about the non-magical versions of each of these weapons and the weapon actions available to each kind of these weapons. So if you're not interested in learning about the weapon actions, feel free to skip ahead to the Adamantine Scimitar. But those are an important component of your strategic decisions and how you should evaluate these weapons, because the weapon actions in Baldur's Gate 3 are actually pretty powerful. We're going to start, of course, with the dagger. The Humble Dagger does 1d4 base damage, which is the lowest amount of damage of any weapon in the game. It's tied with a couple other weapons, but it does the least amount of damage, which means that as a weapon, it is fully outclassed by scimitars and short swords, which allow you to do the same thing, but do 1d6 of damage. Daggers also give you the Piercing Strike weapon action. It's the only weapon action available to them, and Piercing Strike replaces your normal attack with a piercing strike once per short rest, and if an enemy that's hit by it fails a constitution saving throw, then they take 2 extra damage from every attack for 2 turns. If you're burning down a high health enemy, this can be pretty powerful. If you are focusing your whole party's attacks on one character, 2 extra damage from every attack for 2 turns. In the early game can be plus 10, plus 15 damage, not 15 because it's always an even number, but you get the idea. Can be a pretty significant amount of additional damage, which can help you kill an enemy a turn earlier. It's especially good because it's on a dagger, and these weapons are almost always dual-wielded, so if you make a piercing strike with your main hand attack, you can then make a bonus action offhand attack and benefit from the plus 2 damage from the piercing strike. So it's got some inherent synergy on this type of character, as well as being just a very good weapon action overall. It's a little worse than Gaping Wounds, the crossbow version, which does the same thing. Piercing Shot, rather, the crossbow version, which does the same thing, because it's not ranged. So you won't be able to guarantee applying it to the right enemy the way you can with a ranged weapon, but still very powerful. And of course, the enemy that your rogue is next to stabbing with their daggers is probably the enemy that you want to be taking extra damage anyways, so most of the time the targeting on this will be easy. Daggers only do 1d4 of damage, which means that as a weapon, you rarely want to equip them, and you almost never want to equip a non-magical dagger, because a scimitar or a short sword just does the same thing, but better, because they do a d6 of damage, and more damage is better. But nonetheless, daggers are actually a very important item. The non-magical dagger is a very important item in the early game, for a very specific kind of character, throwing characters. Daggers have the thrown weapon property, so non-magical daggers let you throw them and still do full weapon damage and apply a bunch of extra bonuses that you can't sometimes when throwing just a random object. So carrying around a big stack of non-magical daggers makes sure that your throwing character always has a good attack to do, which is extremely useful, because sometimes you might not have a returning weapon yet, or your returning weapon might bug out, which is certainly possible. Hand axes are better for most throwing characters, because daggers do less damage, so they're still not going to be your go-to choice for a lot of throwing characters, but nevertheless very useful to have a big stockpile of these to throw, and so I'm going to give them B tier, despite the fact that you usually don't want to use them as actual weapons. Scimitars. Scimitars do a d6 of damage, so more damage than a dagger, so most characters would prefer to just have a scimitar equipped over having a dagger equipped, because more damage is better. And give you 2 weapon actions instead of 1. The weapon actions available to scimitars are Lacerate and Flourish. Lacerate lets you replace a normal attack with a Lacerate attack, causing enemies to make a Constitution saving throw or they bleed, taking 2 damage every turn and having disadvantage on con saves. That can help you set up other weapon actions or maybe spells that target Constitution, but for the most part it's going to be less damage output than Piercing Strike, so generally I prefer Piercing Strike as a weapon action over Lacerate. And Flourish. Flourish gives you a bonus action that lets you deal a d4 of bludgeoning damage, so you sacrifice a bit of damage compared to just making a bonus action offhand attack with this weapon. Because Flourish takes a bonus action, it's going to replace, for most characters that are dual-wielding, a bonus action offhand attack. But if it lands, the enemy has to make a dexterity saving throw, or all attacks against them gain advantage for 2 turns, and they gain disadvantage on some skill checks. All attacks having advantage against the enemy for 2 turns is really powerful. It's not great the turn you actually use it for the character that's using it, because you're giving up an offhand attack, but it sets up the rest of your party to be able to make attacks with advantage against that enemy, and it sets up your next turn, if the combat goes for another turn and that enemy is still alive, for you to make both of your attacks with advantage against them. Often characters that are dual-wielding love having advantage because it makes them more likely to roll critical hits, if you're a critical hit-based build, or if you are trying to set up a really powerful smite. So having advantage on your attacks is pretty good. It's worse than making 2 attacks in most cases, but still pretty powerful and can help set up the rest of your party. Scimitars, however, are just identical to short swords other than the weapon actions, and you're basically trading Piercing Strike, which short swords get, for Lacerate, which I think is overall worse. So in general, I'm going to place scimitars in D tier, because short swords do exactly the same thing and just have a better weapon action in my opinion. The short sword. Short swords have identical stats to scimitars, doing a d6 of damage and being light and finesse, but swap the Lacerate weapon action for Piercing Strike, which we already talked about in the daggers section, which in my mind is just a strict upgrade in most cases. I would almost always rather have Piercing Strike than Lacerate, so I just prefer having short swords over scimitars. In the early game, it can actually be somewhat difficult to equip your dual-wielding characters with 2 weapons, so you actually will pick up non-magical short swords, replace the starting dagger that some characters start with as well, with multiple short swords. So these non-magical short swords are actually very much worth picking up in the very early game, where you will sometimes wield 2 of them before you get access to magical weapons. Since that can be a little bit of time, I'm going to give them A tier, because you will often want to be on the lookout for these to equip your party in the very, very early game. The +1 versions of the dagger, scimitar, and short sword are available from merchants right from the beginning of the game. So The merchants can spawn with them. It's part of the random loot tables that merchants have, so you may or may not roll one. Depending on whether you're doing a lot of long resting, it might be a little while before a merchant happens to roll with one of these in their inventory, but you should pretty quickly be able to buy at least one of these weapons, and probably two of them, in order to gear out your character. There's a guaranteed location for a +1 dagger early in Act 1. You can find one, it's like buried near the Goblin Camp. I'm not aware of guaranteed locations for +1 scimitars and short swords off the top of my head, though I'm sure someone can tell me in the comments if there are some. But mostly you get these from merchants through the random loot tables. For that reason, you will be able to get them very, very early in the game, because they're available from merchants right away, and they're going to be a significant upgrade over the non-magical versions of these weapons, and they basically follow the same rules. +1 daggers are only useful if you've gotten very unlucky on your merchant rolls and have only rolled into scimitars and short swords. The +1 dagger also is not particularly that much better for throwers, although obviously a little more useful than the normal dagger, but overall I'm going to give the +1 dagger C tier, the +1 scimitar A tier, because it's basically identical to the short sword, so you'll buy whichever one shows up in the merchant first. But of course, the one that you're really looking for to upgrade your 2-weapon fighting attackers is going to be the +1 short sword, which you're going to buy as soon as you see one in the merchant's inventory. +1 to attack and damage is great, especially for this kind of character who's making a lot of attacks. Gives you a ton of additional damage output, and the short sword's the best version of these. First up, the Adamantine Scimitar. The Adamantine Scimitar is a +1 scimitar, so it has +1 to its attacks and damage. And it also ignores slashing resistance, which is moderately useful. There are some enemies with slashing resistance throughout the game. Obviously, it's good when you're trying to do slashing resistance trying to do slashing damage to have a weapon that ignores slashing resistance. And when you attack an object being something that's not alive, so like a door or a wall or a barrel, you'll automatically critical hit. Most of the time in Baldur's Gate, attacking objects isn't that important, though it can help you lockpick to a certain extent. If you are critically hitting an object, you'll ignore the resistance that it has and automatically critical it, so the adamantine weapons can help you break down doors and walls and stuff. Obviously, the thing with the adamantine weapon is that you get it from the adamantine mold, and you can only make 2 of the adamantine items, of which there's a possible 6. In general, the adamantine weapons are much, much worse than the adamantine armor and shields, which I rated quite highly in my armor and shields tier lists, because they will very quickly be outclassed by superior weapons in their category, whereas the adamantine armors are going to stay relevant throughout like a big chunk of the game, or perhaps the entire game, depending on your party composition. The adamantine scimitar is especially weird because it's a scimitar, so it's basically just a +1 scimitar. It's a slightly improved +1 scimitar, but for the most part it's not actually going to be that much better than the other weapons you have available when you get to this point, and it's certainly not the best in its category even within Act 1. So you're probably not even going to meaningfully improve your weapon set if you make the adamantine scimitar. Technically, you could have some use for it if you are using like 2 +1 short swords at this point and are in a party that does not have medium or heavy armor users and has no shield proficient characters, and also doesn't want the longsword or the mace instead of the scimitar, which I think in that situation are both usually better picks. And that is just such a narrow circumstance that the adamantine scimitar, which isn't even a real upgrade, even if you fill all of those conditions, I'm going to put in D tier. You just have way better uses for the adamantine items, and this weapon is just going to make your party worse compared to just getting the shield or something. Even if you aren't using them now, maybe you'll respec later. Having the adamantine shield is really good. The scimitar you will quickly forget about. The Assassin's Touch. The Assassin's Touch is a +1 dagger, so it does 1d4 +1 damage, and it does an extra 1d4 necrotic damage to knocked out or sleeping enemies. As a +1 dagger, it's going to be a little bit better than a non-magical short sword, though not by a ton. It does the same average damage, but hits a little more easily. And obviously worse than the +1 short swords or +1 scimitars that you probably already have available when you get the Assassin's Touch. So the question is, how relevant is dealing an extra 1d4 necrotic damage to knocked out or sleeping enemies? And the answer is basically not particularly. Maybe you could use this alongside Drow Poison for extra damage, or if you have a character that's casting a lot of sleep in your party, then you could maybe use the Assassin's Touch for a little bit of extra damage. If an enemy's knocked unconscious, then you don't really need the extra damage to kill them, because you can just kill them anyways. So the Assassin's Touch dagger is a cool weapon. I really like it from a flavor standpoint, but mechanically it's not particularly useful. That said, it's a +1 dagger that you can get in a guaranteed way early in the game, so if you haven't found a +1 short sword or scimitar yet, then it might be useful to equip your character with as like an offhand weapon. So I'm going to give it C tier, and maybe you could do something cool with Sleeping Poison or another character with sleep for a kind of themed build, but overall you're better off just with weapons that do more damage normally. The Hunter's Dagger. The Hunter's Dagger is another +1 dagger, and when you hit an enemy with it, they have to make a DC 13 Constitution saving throw, or become ruptured for 3 turns. Also, if they pass the saving throw, they become ruptured for 3 turns. This item is bugged, so they make the save, but regardless of whether they pass or fail, it will always apply the ruptured effect on a hit, as long as the enemy isn't in some way immune to it, which actually makes it quite powerful, because ruptured is both an easy way to apply a condition for things that care about conditions, and also in and of itself not a bad condition. Ruptured gives enemies, whenever they move, they take a d4 of damage, and then that will reduce the duration of the condition by 1. So if they move a bunch, they can take 3d4 of damage because it makes them ruptured for 3 turns. And that's like quite a bit of damage. The AI in Baldur's Gate doesn't really understand effects that hurt you when you move. You most often see this with things like spike growth, but it works just fine with ruptured. So if you attack them with the rupture attack and then move away from them, possibly with a bonus action disengage because you're a rogue dual wielding these weapons, then they'll follow you and take the damage from the rupture. This can add a little bit of extra damage to your turn, but mostly just the ability to apply an even remotely relevant effect with every single attack, whether it's a saving throw success or failure, makes the Hunter's Dagger much better than it looks. It's also just a +1 dagger that you get quite early in the game, so overall it can be a pretty powerful addition, and might replace some of your other weapons. The main question, though, is it better than the +1 short swords that you've already had access to from merchants? And for the most part, I think it's not, but it does make a cool alternative for certain builds that care about applying conditions, or are like running around or using forced movement to cause enemies to move, and then they move themselves and get ruptured and stuff. So the Hunter's Dagger can be a really interesting alternative to just the basic additional damage from +1 weapons, so I'm going to give it A tier. Cool weapon, you can do some neat things with it. Overall, not that powerful, but pretty nice addition. Next up, this is probably one of the weapons I've mentioned the most times in my build guides, because it's so useful to such a wide variety of characters, the Knife of the Undermountain King. The Knife of the Undermountain King is a +2 short sword, which means that, first off, it's one of the first +2 weapons available in the game, which makes it awesome in and of itself, just increases your chance to hit your attacks and does more damage than any other weapon you have available at the point where you get the Knife of the Undermountain King. It also has 3 passive effects. They're combined into 2, but there's actually really 3 passive effects that this weapon gives you. The first is that it reduces the number you need to roll to critically hit by 1. This is a passive that works whether you're attacking with this weapon or not, so it will reduce your critical hit requirements on attacks with this weapon, attacks with your offhand weapon, and attacks with other weapons you might have equipped, like bows, and even on attacks with spells, because it doesn't specify only weapon attacks in this case. So anytime you roll an attack roll, if you have the Knife of the Undermountain King equipped, you're going to critically hit more often. That's hugely powerful for any character that benefits from getting critical hits. Obviously, rogues to double their sneak attack dice, paladins to double their smite damage, warlocks with the Great Old One Pact to cause fear, and of course, critically hitting on Eldritch Blasts is also a bunch of damage, and just any character that benefits from critical hits, of which there are a lot. A lot of late game setups are going to revolve around frequent critical hits, especially for archery characters, which this is another just best in slot item for as a melee weapon for archery characters, because it increases their chance to critically hit with their bow attacks as well. In addition to that, when you actually use the weapon as a weapon, rather than just a stat stick to increase your critical hit chance, you re-roll any damage dice with weapon attacks made with this weapon if they roll a 2 or less. That includes any damage dice that are added to the weapon roll. So if you have like the Flawed Helldust Gloves to add damage dice to your attacks and roll a 1 or 2 on those will be re-rolled if you're sneak attacking or smiting using the Knife of the Undermountain King attack. Then those weapon attacks those damage dice will be re-rolled as well. Massively powerful for characters that don't want to attack with short swords, and massively powerful for characters that do, with even more power for ones that are actually using the weapon. Finally, when you attack with this weapon, you have advantage on your attacks against lightly or heavily obscured targets. So enemies that are in darkness, you will have advantage against with weapon attacks made with the Knife of the Undermountain King. So you'll have advantage, you'll reroll damage dice, and you'll critically hit more often, as well as just being a +2 weapon. Obviously, I've said only good things about this weapon, and it's one that comes up again and again and again in build guide after build guide, both for characters that use short swords and characters that do not. The Knife of the Undermountain King, of course, is S tier and has tremendous applications. Definitely do not leave this one at home because it's very important, pretty much no matter what character you're building. The Ritual Dagger. The Ritual Dagger is a magical dagger, but without an enhancement bonus. So it has no +1 bonus or anything like that, and will attack and deal damage exactly the way that a normal dagger would. Not a great start for a magical weapon, of course, but it has 2 abilities that might power it up. The first of these is when you hit an enemy with this dagger, you gain 1 turn of Bless. So an extra d4 to your attack rolls and to your saving throws. Secondly, you can, as a bonus action, deal 1d4 slashing damage to yourself and gain 1 turn of Bless. This works exactly the same as the normal Bless spell, doesn't stack with Bless from the spell, doesn't stack with itself, so if you use the bonus action and hit an enemy in the same turn, you still will only have 1 turn of Bless, and doesn't stack with the buff on heal items, the Whispering Promise that blesses your character. So it is hard to use this effect because a lot of parties are going to be blessed already, whether they have someone cast it on them or are using the buff on heal items. And then even still, when you actually use this weapon, you have to hit with it first or deal damage to yourself in order to activate it, and it only lasts for 1 turn. Honestly, I feel like it should last for 2 turns to make this weapon a little bit more interesting, because 1 turn of upkeep on the Ritual Dagger is kind of hard to manage. But as is, because it conflicts with so many other things, and isn't even that powerful a bonus, it's +2.5 to your chance to hit, but it's a non-magical dagger, so you're sacrificing +1 to your chance to hit and damage to get that, and then get that situationally sometimes. It applies to your other weapons as well, so if you have like a really powerful main hand weapon that you just want to power up and hit with, the Ritual Dagger could maybe be useful, but for the most part I think that this weapon just conflicts with too many other things that your characters are probably trying to do, and won't give you a significant advantage as a result. I'm going to put it in C tier because Bless is always interesting. It's not a bad... Bless is a powerful spell regardless, but the Ritual Dagger's situational application of very short duration Bless is kind of overpowered by the other ways to get that in the game. The Shortsword of First Blood. The Shortsword of First Blood is a magical shortsword with no enhancement bonus, just like the Ritual Dagger, so it attacks just like a normal non-magical shortsword for a d6 of damage. But if you hit a character that has all of their hit points with it, it does an extra d8 of piercing damage to them. So if you hit a full health character, you do a d6 plus a d8, which is way more damage than you would be doing with just a +1 shortsword. Very good against enemies that are unhurt, but significantly weaker against enemies that have already been hurt. The way to use the short sword of First Blood, of course, is to attack with it first in a combat, so you can kill enemies that haven't gotten hit yet. But also there are additional ways to maximize its effects in order to get the most out of the extra damage. First off, this extra damage is added as a damage die, an extra d8 of damage, so it gets doubled if you critically hit with the short sword of First Blood on your first attack against an enemy. An assassin rogue can guarantee critical hits with their first attack in a combat, so the short sword will always do double damage for them if they're winning initiative, which of course this character should, making it an excellent weapon for assassin rogue characters to deal additional damage with their short swords. Also, any other character with high initiative, which of course these are dexterity attacking characters who are using these weapons, is going to benefit from this, because the likelihood of hitting is still pretty good even without the enhancement bonus from your weapon. You can maybe attack from hiding for advantage or something like that as well. And so the short sword of First Blood will go off a pretty decent amount of the time and get you the extra d8 of damage, which is more powerful than the +1. Overall, I think that the short sword of First Blood is easy enough to trigger, and powerful enough when you do trigger it, especially because a lot of these characters will be fishing for critical hit, will have guaranteed ways to critically hit, will be attacking with advantage, so they'll get critical hits, that it is an excellent item for any character that wants to be dual-wielding weapons. It's probably the second weapon that you will use if you're not dual-wielding, so if you're a character that's using a finesse weapon in their main hand, but a shield in their offhand, for example, you would prefer the Knife of the Undermountain King over this, of course. But the short sword of First Blood just does a ton of extra damage. It's going to be way more average damage in most fights to have this than the +1 weapon, and so it's going into S tier. The Speedy Reply. The Speedy Reply is another magical weapon, in this case a scimitar, without an enhancement bonus, so it attacks exactly like a normal scimitar for a d6 of slashing damage. When you hit an enemy with it, you gain 2 turns of momentum, which increases your movement speed by 5 feet for each turn of momentum remaining, giving you 10 feet of extra movement speed. Now, momentum is less useful after you've already hit an enemy. Still very powerful as an effect, because mobility is really important, especially for characters like rogues and stuff that want to move in and out of combat using their mobility in order to stay out of reach of enemy counterattacks. But still less useful overall than if you had it at the beginning of combat to make sure that you could reach an enemy. One of the main uses for move speed on a melee character is to get to an enemy so you don't effectively stun yourself by having to dash on the first turn of combat, and the Speedy Reply doesn't give that to you. In addition to that, it is less good at dealing damage than the +1 weapons that you already have access to at this point in the game. Though you do get this relatively early in Act 1, you just find it on the ground, on the road, so you will be able to use this weapon if it's the one that you want, or if you don't have the +1 weapons. It can be maybe useful as part of a momentum build to try to maintain high momentum and move around. You could use it to kite around with, and movement speed is always pretty good. You also get this weapon quite early, so there's a decent chance that you haven't had a merchant roll a +1 weapon yet. So for all of those reasons, I'm going to give it B tier, although you will quickly replace this weapon if you do want to use it. It just has a moderately useful effect, but worse overall than just doing more damage. The Steelforged Sword. The Steelforged Sword is a normal +1 short sword. It's identical in stats to a normal +1 short sword, but it is slightly notable in that it is guaranteed to spawn in the Blighted Village, so if you haven't rolled +1 short swords from merchants, the Steelforged Sword is going to be pretty useful. I'm going to give it B tier just because it is a guaranteed way to get a +1 short sword without having to buy it from a merchant, and that's always great. Probably you can have your +1 weapons already if you've been rolling for them, but if you haven't, then this will give them to you, and that's awesome. The Sussur Dagger. The Sussur Dagger is a +1 dagger. It's a quest reward, and you have to choose between a greatsword version, a sickle version, and a dagger version of this weapon, so it'll depend a little bit on your party composition. In addition to being a +1 dagger, when you hit an enemy with it, only in melee, this doesn't work if you throw the dagger, which is a little sad because it is a thrown weapon. But if you hit an enemy in melee, they have to make a Constitution save or become silenced. Silence is obviously a devastating condition for spellcasters, and so very, very good for any fight where there's a caster in it, but also of special note for honor mode, because a lot of legendary actions from bosses with legendary actions require them to make a sound, and so don't work if they're silenced. That means the Sussur Dagger, in addition to shutting down enemy spellcasters very easily by reapplying silence to them over and over again until you have stabbed them to death, also works to shut down a lot of the most dangerous bosses in the game by reapplying silence to them over and over again. Obviously, this weapon doesn't do much in an encounter where silence isn't relevant, so it's one that you will swap in and out depending on the encounter. Typically, you're going to be better off with a +1 shortsword for more damage, or the other magical weapons available at this point in the game for more damage, but in encounters where silence is good, the Sussur Dagger is going to be incredible. One question is, do you want it over the sickle or the greatsword? And the answer is, I think that the dagger actually is better because you don't sacrifice that character's ability to do damage as much with the dagger version, because they will probably have a second weapon, which can be whatever your strongest weapon for that character is, and then use both of them to have them both apply silence and do damage. And a lot of characters that are using daggers, damage comes from other sources like sneak attacks and smites anyways. So the Sussur Dagger, I think, is the best of the three weapons, provided that your party could use all three of them. Obviously, if you have a greatsword user and not a dagger user, you want the greatsword, but if all other things being equal, the dagger is probably the best of the three. The only question for me is whether I give it S tier because it's so good in the encounters that it's good in, or A tier because it's only good in some encounters. And I think I'm going to give it A tier because you do swap it in and out, the Sussur Dagger, but this is a very powerful item, and one that's very much worth keeping in mind if you have a character that can use it, because the encounters that it's good in, it's awesome in. The Baneful. The Baneful is a pretty cool weapon. Firstly, I like the icon model. And it's another weapon that has a pretty misleading tooltip and sort of lies to you about how it works. So for those of you who are keeping track of Baldur's Gate's misleading tooltips, here's another one for you. The Baneful is a +1 shortsword, and it says the magical effects of this weapon only apply if it's bound as a pact weapon, but that +1 is not included in that statement. So it's always at least a +1 shortsword. In addition to that, if it is bound as a pact weapon for an Eldritch Knight, if it's an Eldritch Knight's bound weapon, or a Pact of the Blade Warlock's pact weapon, you get an extra +1 on your attack and damage rolls, turning it into a +2 weapon, and whenever you hit an enemy, they have to make a charisma saving throw or become baned. The Baneful, therefore, applies a pretty powerful condition, and if it is a bound weapon, is a quite solid weapon overall. A +2 sword available this early in the game is always worth looking at, because +2 weapons are scarce at this point. And while a lot of warlocks and Eldritch Knights won't want to use a short sword as their pact weapon, because they'd prefer like a two-handed weapon for more damage, or a one-handed weapon and with that attacks with their strength, plus a shield for an Eldritch Knight, for example, the Baneful makes a pretty good weapon if you're a dexterity-based Eldritch Knight, or a Pact of the Blade Warlock who's attacking with their charisma, and it doesn't matter what kind of weapon you use. At this point in the game, it is very possible that this is the best weapon available to those kinds of characters, if you're a melee Eldritch Knight who's using a one-handed weapon, or a Pact of the Blade Warlock who's using a one-handed weapon. And because that's a very powerful ability, and it's also just a +1 short sword all the time, so if you are hurting for +1 weapons by the time you get this, you probably won't, but if you've gotten super, super unlucky with finding +1 weapons, I'm going to give the Baneful A tier, because it's decent on any character, but actually quite good on the characters that it's meant for, because it's a +2 weapon with a very relevant effect. Reducing enemy saving throws with the Bane effect is especially good for Eldritch Knights and Warlocks, who may also be casting spells, and can potentially use the Bane effect to land those spells more easily. And it also applies a condition, so that can be relevant for characters that care about attacking with conditions, especially Warlocks. So for a Warlock character especially, Eldritch Knight's a little less so, the Baneful is definitely a viable option when you get it, and maybe the best option to bind as your pact weapon. And finally, for the Act 1 weapons, Worgfang. Worgfang is a dagger with no enhancement bonus, so just attacks for a d4. But it has a passive effect where goblins have disadvantage on attack rolls against the wielder. Obviously, this is only useful in fights against goblins, so the question is, how good is that in fights against goblins? The answer is for a rogue or character that's making weapon attacks with their daggers, it's probably not that great. Those characters will tend to have okay armor class at this point in the game, because they're dexterity characters, so the goblins may target other characters anyways, and also have good tools for getting out of combat if they're taking damage, and you want those characters to have excellent damage output so that they can kill their targets immediately, so it's a real cost to equip a weapon that reduces their damage output, even if you're fighting goblins. However, Worgfang makes an awesome offhand weapon for a wizard, for example. Any spellcaster can use like Worgfang in their main hand and a shield in their offhand, and just benefit from the passive effect, or can just carry 2 weapons for that fight and use Worgfang in their offhand instead of a shield. And that will make your spellcasters or other characters that you really don't want the goblins focusing down much, much harder to kill. The goblin camp is actually one of the more threatening encounters in the early game because the goblins have a lot of archers, and so they will focus down your vulnerable characters. Worgfang can prevent that from happening because your character with the lowest AC can just equip this weapon, benefit from the passive effects, even if they're not actually able to attack with it at all. An archer, for example, can have this equipped and benefit from the passive while still just using their bow. And so Worgfang gives you a very powerful passive effect for some of the more difficult encounters in the very, very early game. Now, of course, you're going to stop using this as soon as you're done fighting goblins, but there's a few fights against goblins, so Worgfang will be useful for those fights. I'm going to give it B tier, but this is a B tier that I want to include a caveat to, which is that this item, I think, is highly underrated for helping you through the early game of Baldur's Gate 3, and you should pay attention to it, because it can really make your more vulnerable characters much less endangered in the early game fights against goblins, which is when they're at their most vulnerable. So, at the end of Act 1, you will have been using generic +1 short swords or scimitars for most of the act. Whichever ones show up at the merchants first, you can just buy those and be happy to use them. And then by the end of the act, you'll be using the short sword of First Blood, if you're a character who can make good use of it. And probably most characters can. You will only not use this if you're a very heavy AoE damage party, for example, so you want to start every fight by grouping enemies and dropping AoE on them, and then can't use the short sword for extra damage, but most characters will benefit from that. But of course, the king of the castle is the knife of the Undermountain king. I guess the king of the mountain is the knife of the Undermountain king, which is by far the best of these weapons available in Act 1, and will remain a powerful and best-in-slot weapon for these characters throughout the entire game, as well as a powerful passive effect for other characters throughout the whole game. If you're an Eldritch Knight or Pact of the Blade Warlock, you may be looking at the Baneful if you're a one-handed weapon attacker, and that this can also just be the best Warlock weapon in the early game, depending on your path through the game. And of course, for encounters where it's good, where silence is relevant, you'll be swapping in the Sussur Dagger. Overall, Knife of the Undermountain King is the most important of these weapons. The rest of them are very useful, but that's the one you really, really have to pay attention to. Alright, my friends, unfortunately, I have been recovering from a cold the past couple days, so I'm trying to rest my voice, so this will be a bit of a shorter tier list video. But we did get through all the Act 1 weapons. And I'll probably do Act 2 and 3 in just Part 2, because there aren't that many left, and now that we know all the weapon actions, we'll be able to cover them a little bit faster. But I hope you enjoyed this look at all of the short swords, scimitars, and daggers in Act 1. These are part of some of the highest damage setups in the entire game, because they let you attack more times if you're dual wielding, and also because they're finesse weapons, let characters build just pure dexterity, so they're part of some of the most powerful and most optimized builds in the game, and I hope that this ranking helps you build your honor mode parties. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, of course, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I do appreciate it. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 analysis, including part 2 of the Short Swords and Daggers and Scimitars tier list, and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends, and I will catch you next time.